So my presentation is on hockey's multicultural common spaces, and I'm exploring notions of identity social integrations for immigrants and racialized minorities. My co-investigator for this project is Howard Ramos from Western, and research associates for this project involved Martine Denis at Manitoba, Patrick Bondi at Dalhousie, and Mohana Mukherjee at the University of Calgary. So the fundamental research question here for us was, does the engagement in the game of hockey contribute to the social integration of immigrants and or racialized minorities in Canada? By engagement, we mean not just playing the game of hockey, but it also means more broadly being connected to the game in some way, such as being a hockey fan, a hockey parent, coach, manager, official, an arena worker, whatever, you're connected to the game. Our theoretical framework hinges around two basic concepts. One is multicultural common spaces, and the other is interactive pluralism. So let me explain these two. Multicultural common spaces are simply where people from diverse backgrounds are able to interact. And the argument here is that interaction, they'll develop a shared sense of Canadian identity, which may in turn foster a sense of belonging to their community and to Canada. So multicultural common spaces that are hockey related then include arenas, but not simply the ice surface, but the stands, the corridors, the lobbies, and other very public places, such as on the street and public squares. For example, in Calgary, there's the Red Mile when the Flames are making the playoffs, and Jurassic Park, as most people know, in Toronto, but also more mundane other public places like sports bars online and online virtual spaces like online hockey forums and websites. Interactive pluralism, I'll explain on the next slide using Venn diagrams. So each of the smaller circles within the larger circles represent immigrant, non-immigrant, racialized, and non-racialized communities. I think the best way to understand interactive pluralism is to look at its antithesis, that is the polar opposite, and that is fragmented pluralism, which is on the right-hand side. So fragmented pluralism is where the communities are insular, they're inward-looking, they're segregated, they don't have much to do with each other. This often creates in a society ethnic silos and ethnic enclaves. In contrast, a particular society that has interactive pluralism, there's ongoing interaction amongst the communities. And hence you can see here the arrows connecting up all the little circles. There's mutual recognition, there's a cultivation of a common understanding, and perhaps of a civil society. So hockey spaces that are multicultural and allow for interactive pluralism then fosters or facilitates then a sense of identity and belonging. And we argue that that could be one of the many pathways to social integration in Canada. The research methods we used for this project, which started in the 2018-19 hockey season, and we were cut short with the pandemic a little bit, but we have enough data to complete the project, involves structured observations in hockey arenas, including taking photos in some cases, and many face-to-face interviews with hockey players, fans, including parents of younger players and key informants. And there were 3 research sites for this project: Halifax, Toronto, and Calgary. And we used NVivo to analyze the interviews. The total data collected were 55 structured observations and 100 photos. I don't have time in this presentation to talk about our findings about structured observations, and we're still doing some of the data analysis. What I'm presenting today are the 143 personal interviews that we conducted in the 3 cities. Just a brief demographic description of the 143 participants. 74% were males, 26% were females. The ages ranged from 11 to 79 years old, a median age of 35. 72% were Canadian born, 28% were immigrants. 60% were Caucasian or white, and 39% were racialized minorities. And of course, these last two categories, there was significant overlap in the sense that the majority of immigrants were also racialized minorities. Okay, let's look at the findings here. First, we'll look at Canadian identity via hockey. There's two figures here. The one on the left is how hockey contributes to Canadian identity by nativity. So participants were asked, well, whether they thought that hockey contributes to a Canadian identity. Well, while both immigrants and Canadian-born feel that hockey contributes considerably to Canadian identity, this association is stronger for immigrants, 95%, the red bar, than it is for the Canadian-born, the gray bar at 82%. In looking at racialized minority status, again, both racialized minorities and whites feel that hockey contributes to Canadian identity. And again, this association is greater for racialized minorities at 91%, the orange bar, and the yellow bar for whites is 81%, so a little bit lower. Let me provide you with a quote from many of our participants who talked about Canadian identity. This is a quote from Onan, a 16-year-old Turkish Bangladeshi immigrant minor hockey player who's played in Halifax. He states, like watching hockey, playing hockey, being involved in hockey, you're seen as someone like Canadian, obviously, because it's like mostly Canadian sport, derived in Canada. So yeah, it definitely does make me feel Canadian when I have to do anything related to hockey. Now for the sense of belonging through hockey, our second major exploration. If you look at the figure on the left, you can see that when you look at nativity, that is comparing immigrants to the Canadian-born, a significant majority of immigrants feel that hockey contributes to their sense of belonging to Canada, while only less than half of the Canadian-born feel that it does. And that's the 45% here. So a fairly large gap between immigrants and Canadian-born. Similarly, when we look at racialized minority status, we see also a large majority of racialized minorities, 73%, the brown bar, feel that hockey contributes to their sense of belonging to Canada, while again, less than half of whites feel that it does, 42%, the yellow bar. Here's a quote on sense of belonging from Arafa, a Maple Leafs fan in her late 20s and a 1.5 gen from India. This is what she has to say. Even watching hockey will make you feel more Canadian. It'll make you feel you belong. When I go to Maple Leaf Square, even if I go to a hockey game, even if it's people who don't look like me around me, I still feel like I belong there. I feel like I'm connected to the sport, especially with newcomers and immigrants. It's like hockey is one of those things that you can watch and you can kind of immediately feel you're part of the bigger community. So that's her way of describing the sense of belonging that she has. So here's a photo that was taken at the Calgary Flames versus Toronto Maple Leafs game right before the pandemic hit. Here we see three guys talking. We weren't sure what they were talking. We were busy trying to take this picture. And at one point they were quite animated, but by the time we got into the shot, they're a little less animated, but they're engaged in conversation. And what we argue is this conversation is illustrative of interactive pluralism. So going back to the research question, does engagement in the game of hockey contribute to the social integration of immigrants and or racialized minorities? Our answer is yes. Hockey, we argue, fosters a Canadian identity and a sense of belonging to Canada for immigrants and racialized minorities. That in turn helps to facilitate their integration into Canada. The major takeaway, I think, from the data that I presented this morning is grow the game of hockey by eliminating all the barriers, including racism, and diversifying the game so that hockey is for all. This will create another pathway of integration for immigrants and racialized minorities. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Dr. Wong. How are you doing?
With you.
Good, thank you. Thanks so much for your presentation, and it's nice to see you after basically the COVID break. I think is the last time I saw you in person. So I think some of the statistics are certainly interesting in the stratification of kind of how people identify and use hockey in that space. So your research is focused on new Canadians for the most part, using hockey as a way to integrate themselves into quote unquote the mainstream. But there's also a growing area of research on initiatives like Black Girl Hockey Club, which just launched its Canadian chapter, and organizations like Upna Hockey, which were both created by racialized people, but non-immigrants who did not feel welcome in hockey culture. So how can we make sense of some of these what seem like opposing messages? On the one hand, we can use hockey to facilitate integration, but on the other hand, for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who have existed in the hockey community and were kind of born into Canada and the United States, they kind of are looking for a way out, or at least a space where there's like respite from the racism that they face in hockey. And maybe this speaks to some of the statistical gap that you showed on your slides, but I'll love for you to comment on that.
Yes, those segregated leagues, I think, are an illustration of fragmented pluralism, right? There's a segregation, and the problem with analyzing hockey is it's, I've argued this with Martine in another article, that hockey is very Janus-faced, right? So you have the ugly side of hockey, which then contributes to exclusion and the feeling of not wanted, and hence the development of segregated leagues and teams. But then there's a positive side, which reflects some of the data we've collected here that show a more positive side of hockey. So I'm not sure we really need to reconcile it more so than acknowledge that both exists. That's how I would argue that.
Thank you. You got a couple of questions in the chat box here. First question from Taylor. Might be jumping the gun, but were the senses of belonging explained in any way that suggested where their community supported and included them? As in, there's a huge difference between belonging, quote unquote, and fitting in without issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, we did the in vivo analysis. In fact, we used the word fit in. We tried to see where people, like most of our respondents, didn't use so much sense of belonging. They talked about being fitting in. So, and it was more in the sense of fitting into the community, which we extrapolated as perhaps leading to a sense of belonging to Canada as well. Because if you feel comfortable in your community, I think that's the first step of feeling comfortable in your country.
Great. The next question, given that hockey can influence the Canadian identity and sense of belonging of immigrants, do you have any suggestions on how organizations can help get more immigrants involved, such as affordable beginner programs?
Yeah, so something I didn't talk about in this presentation is when we did the research, we asked about barriers to hockey, and that is what prevented people from participating, and the one that scored the highest was economic barriers, followed by racism. So we made some suggestions in terms of, and I think the NHL in their latest publication on diversity has made these kinds of suggestions, as well as perhaps subsidize hockey, the equipment at some level, in some way. Now, that would take government initiatives, and maybe Sport Canada might be interested in this, and how you do that. Several ways we can think about it is maybe subsidizing the operation of arenas, so the cost of playing hockey becomes less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting with things like Canadian Jumpstart programs and things like that versus hockey parents are telling me that there are more and more privatized leagues that are popping up now. So it's not even the academies. They're going beyond that and getting more expensive and more inclusive. So as we start to see more diversity in the game, you see the game just kind of running away with the cost aspect of it. And I honestly don't even know how this all kind of comes to a head eventually.
It's really too bad, actually. So.
Another question is, based on these findings, do you think they can be transferred to other sports? Would it be fair to assume that all sport, when free of discrimination, can increase new Canadian sense of belonging?
Oh, certainly, yes. But hockey has a little special space in that, in the sense that there's that kind of official recognition that it, through legislation, that it's referred to as Canada's national game. So, but it certainly transfers to other sports as well, in the sense that sports in general, where you have multicultural common spaces, allow for cultural pluralism, to engage with each other rather than be more insular looking.
Right. You have a question here asking about the research participants. Were they mainly people who were involved with hockey as spectators or players? Or what I mean to ask is, were newcomers and racialized populations who are not involved in hockey captured in the statistics around how important it is to identity?
No, we just interviewed those engaged with hockey and then asked about sense of belonging and identity.
And can I ask how you actually captured all of those interview participants, which it was a lot. You folks interviewed a lot of people. Yes. So how did you recruit those folks?
It's a lot of word by mouth, but we put up posters in arenas that we were interested in going to. And in particular, in cities of Calgary and Toronto, particularly, we went to arenas that were closer to communities that tended to be more diverse, to ensure, because we wanted to capture immigrants and racialized minorities. And also in Calgary, we put an ad in the Hockey Calgary magazine. So it was mostly posters and ads.
Right. And so we are pulling from folks who are already kind of part of the hockey community. Another question here. Thank you for the presentation. In your research, have you taken into account the concept of quote unquote belonging as indicative of engagement that is manifested by cheering for the same team, as an example, in which sense of belonging becomes more pronounced?
No, we didn't ask that particular question, and we didn't find that much in the data in the sense of belonging to the particular team. It was more that we were asking, well, how does the sport of hockey make you feel? So it was more generally the sport rather than specific teams they belong to. But you can anticipate that there'll be a cultivation of a sense of team kind of spirit that develops.
Do you feel that hockey has particular characteristics that allow the kind of interactive pluralism that you mentioned that other sports may not, such as the physical space in venues or the way that spectators can mingle?
I think so, but I haven't done an analysis of all the other sports. I mean, some sports are there's less of that kind of social space where that would happen. Just trying to think of one that might be like that. What might be a sport where you have less kind of interactive pluralism in the spaces? Maybe golf would be very different, right? Where there's the fan base is just following or sitting at specific holes. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was the example I was thinking of right away too, was golf. What are the next steps for your research project, just briefly before we leave here?
Well, we wrote a report for Sport Canada, and so I think this basically concludes my area of expertise has not so much been in sport, but it's been in the area of multiculturalism and citizenship. So for me, it's I'm not. I think this is the end in the sense of us looking at senses of multiculturalism. So I'm not planning to pursue it further, but I'm hopeful that others will pick up this particular topic and carry it forward.
Excellent. Great way to end off our session. Thanks to everybody for joining us virtually, and thanks very much to Dr. Wong for the presentation.
Thanks, Courtney.